Toccata and Fugue in D minor was written for the organ by Johann Sebastian Bach between 1703 and 1717. The symphonic transcription was orchestrated as well as conducted by Leopold Stokowski. The Disney version is a pictorial description of the form of the music. A toccata is Fantasia-like music in a free style, while a fugue interweaves several musical themes in a strict pattern. So Disney begins by improvising with images that are technicolor impressions of the orchestra in performance. We see Stokowski walk up to the podium, call the orchestra to attention with his hands, since he never used a baton, and start conducting against a background that responds to the music by darkening from cobalt blue to dark maroon. The podium, as a mountain-like dais, giving prominence to whomever occupies it, is a motif that will recur throughout the film. The actual conductor's podium, up which Mickey Mouse runs to shake Stokowski's hand, the mountaintop from which Disney conducts the stars and planets, Bald Mountain from which the devil conducts the Walpurgis Night dance of the damned. Real or fanciful, it is the central image of Fantasia. What we see on the screen are pictures of the shifting abstract images that might pass before the mind's eye as we sit in a concert hall listening to this music. At first we are more or less conscious of the orchestra, so the toccata begins with images that are impressions of the orchestra itself. Multiple shadows of 9 violinists accompany a violin passage. Triple red shadows of cellists on a blue background appear when the cellos are heard. 3 French horns are seen in silhouette and light up when they play. A harp glows gold against blue. The fugue begins, and the images become less and less concrete. The theme repeats 7 times in the course of the fugue, and each time the graphic form changes with the development of the musical theme. Abstract music is reflected visually in abstract images that resemble both violin bows and swallows, and flit like swallows. Musical calls and answers are interpreted as changes of color washing over the screen, or as moving spots of color, or string bass shapes calling and their shadows answering. Shafts of light build up on a black screen until they too suggest the recurring podium image. Interestingly, the end of Fantasia's first number is an abstraction of the end of Fantasia's final number. In the fugue, cloud forms suggest a Gothic cathedral, as trees will do in the Ave Maria. There is an abstract hint in the Bach of a shattered stained glass window falling that will be echoed later in the Schubert when light assumes the shape of a cathedral window. The Bach concludes with a sunset and columns of light that suggest the pipes of an organ, a foreshadowing of the Schubert ending where the pre-dawn sky is filled with color by a sunrise. "You will be able to see the music and hear the picture," said Walt Disney of his hopes for Fantasia, "and you can read in excerpts from the transcripts of their story meetings how Disney and Stokowski and their associates worked toward achieving that aim." In a story meeting on the Toccata and Fugue held on Tuesday afternoon, November 8, 1938, John McLeish, a story artist with the manner of John Barrymore, began talking about the contrast between the screen and the music. His stentorian tones can later be heard narrating the opening of Dumbo. "In the fugue," suggested McLeish, "why not picture a huge form moving slowly against a counterpoint in the music, or just the opposite, when you have a slow, heavy chord, picture little light forms playing against that. Stokowski was in immediate agreement. When there is counterpoint in the music, he said, there should be counterpoint in the picture. The music explains the screen, and the screen explains the music. We must make it clear. Much of the strength of Disney's images came from their clarity and simplicity, so Disney now knew where he wanted to go with the studio's visualization of the Toccata and Fugue in D minor by Johann Sebastian Bach. There are things in that music that the general public will not understand until they see things on the screen representing that music, said Disney. Then they will feel the depth in the music. Our object is to reach the very people who have walked out on this Toccata and Fugue because they didn't understand it. I am one of those people, but when I understand it, I like it. Sir Herbert Reed, in Art and Alienation, called Walt Disney a quote-unquote great expressionist. But Disney was a storyteller first and foremost, so the aim of abstract expressionism, which seeks to express feeling and emotion solely through color and non-objective or non-representational form, was secondary to his most important aim of developing definite personalities in his cartoon characters. Nonetheless, he was experimenting with various combinations of music and pictures in Fantasia, and Stokowski and Deems Taylor had told him that there are three kinds of music. Music that tells a story, such as The Sorcerer's Apprentice, music that paints a picture, such as the Pastoral Symphony, with its music portrait of nature, and absolute music, or music for music's sake. Disney said he had been interested in abstract films when he saw Len Lei's animated abstract film, Color Box, in the mid-1930s. There was an Englishman named Len Lye who did color and movement to music, wrote Disney. He applied this directly on film by painting on the film itself. And Stokowski had once conducted an experimental concert which combined the music of the Philadelphia Orchestra with a color organ. So Disney decided to make the first selection of the Fantasia program a further experiment in interpreting the tone colors and sound patterns of music in the colors and moving patterns on the screen. The Toccata and Fugue was chosen, said the program, not only because it is magnificent music, but also because it lends itself to this type of interpretation, it being music which neither seeks to tell a story nor paint a picture, but exists solely for the beauty of its own tone patterns. Disney himself explained in 1944, the abstractions that were done in Toccata and Fugue were no sudden idea. Rather, they were something we had nursed along for several years, but we never had a chance to try due to the fact that the types of pictures being made up to that time did not allow us to incorporate any of this type of material in them. Actually, it was an outgrowth of our effects department which we organized long before we had any contact with Stokowski. The idea of color in music is very old. The color organ is really the key to it all, and that goes way back. I remember seeing such a demonstration in 1928. Continuing his discussion on color abstractions, Disney wrote, Cy Young did something on this before he came to us, which was in 1935 or 1936. I remember him showing me stuff set to Mendelssohn's Spring Song. Disney put Cy Young in charge of his effects department, and when it was decided to include an abstract film in the concert feature, as Fantasia was then called, naturally he put Young in charge of the project. Sometime in 1937 or 1938, we happened to see a reel of a film by a fellow named Oskar Fischinger, a German, who was brought to our attention by an agent who wanted to get him a job. I had a talk with the fellow, and although I wasn't too impressed with him personally, when I saw his abstractions in color set to certain music, I got the idea of having him work on the concert feature and gave him the job. He was employed by us from November 28, 1938 to October 31, 1939. Because of his previous experience with abstractions, he worked on Toccata and Fugue throughout the period of his employment. It was Oskar Fischinger who pioneered the animation of abstract lines and shapes to music that became the film form used in the opening number of Fantasia. In Germany, in his study number 8, in 1931, he used the first half of Dukas' The Sorcerer's Apprentice, though Fischinger made no attempt to tell the story of the magician's helper in his abstract film. 2 years before Len Lai, in 1933, Fischinger had made his first color-on-film movie in Europe, Criesse, Circles. Paramount Pictures offered Fischinger a contract, and he came to the United States in February 1936. But Fischinger, like Disney, was used to having total control over his films. Fischinger's color animation of a symphonic episode called Radio Dynamics was planned for the big broadcast of 1937 and would have been the first abstract sequence in a commercial feature, but Fischinger brought it in overtime, over budget, and in color. The feature was in black and white, and that's the way Paramount wanted its abstract sequence. The sequence was not used in the film, and Fischinger left Paramount after 6 months. Leopold Stokowski conducted his orchestral arrangement of Bach's Fugue in G minor in the big broadcast of 1937, and according to William Moritz, in the film of Oskar Fischinger, Fischinger spoke to Stokowski about making a film based on the conductor's orchestral arrangements of Bach's Toccata and Fugue in D minor. Stokowski, says Moritz, would not sign over the rights to his arrangement without being sure that there was adequate financial backing to produce the film properly. So, how did the Toccata and Fugue get into Fantasia? According to the story meaning transcripts, Disney and Stokowski and their associates listened to a record of the composition in the Disney studio conference room on Saturday morning, September 10, 1938, nearly 3 months before Fischinger joined the staff. In their search for compositions to use in Fantasia, they listened to hundreds of recordings. Disney had an idea for a segment about a witch's tale, and hearing Toccata and Fugue, he said, "I'm looking for a place to use the devil who is supposed to play the violin. I believe that is too straight for our purposes," said Stokowski, and recommended instead that Night on Bald Mountain would be good for a witch's tale. Walt bought that idea of Stokowski's, but he did not forget about Toccata and Fugue. For the story meeting held 19 days later, a 5-page summary of 12 compositions contemplated for our musical feature was circulated among the artists and musicians in attendance. It showed that Disney had decided to do a witch's revel to Night on Bald Mountain and an abstract film to the Toccata and Fugue. To abstract and mathematical music of grandeur, read the summary, we give an abstract interpretation, abstractions, geometrical and color patterns. A fugue is the weaving together of several themes, and this has given Walt the idea for a very novel effect. All about the theaters will be concealed loudspeakers. Thus, for example, we can get the effect of the music marching about the theater, coming from the ceiling, one theme moving in one direction, a second theme circling the theater in the opposite direction, all meeting at the back of the theater and marching down the aisle in unison. We are also considering third-dimensional effects for this number. Disney's idea to include 3D glasses with cardboard frames in the Fantasia program and make the Toccata and Fugue the first commercial 3D film, 12 years before Buona Devil, was later abandoned, but experiments on Fantasound were already underway, and Fantasia did become the birthplace of the first stereophonic sound system in motion pictures. On September 3rd, Walt told Bill Garrity, his sound recording expert, that he and Stokowski wanted a unique system of speakers that would surround the audience with sound. Fanta Sound had its first test on September 28th, the day before the Toccata was listed among the selections being proposed for Fantasia. Garrity set up a test system on the soundstage and demonstrated it for Disney and Stokowski. The circular speaker control consisted of a continuously rotated fader maintaining constant output level from 4 loudspeakers placed in the corners of the stage, wrote Garrity. The illusion is very effective and can produce a degree of dizziness on the part of the listener. Disney's fascination with the soundtrack was finding its visual equivalent in the Toccata and Fugue. On November 8, 1938, Cy Young displayed color sketches picturing designs derived from soundtracks, progressing into rhythmic or movement patterns of pseudo-soundtrack design, then into fantastic designs with no relation to the soundtrack. "What does the Toccata and Fugue represent?" Disney asked Stokowski as he studied Young's sketches. "It is a motif or decorative pattern which gradually develops more and more," Stokowski said, "just as you have done here with the designs of the soundtrack. Finally, it becomes perfectly free. The theme which comes at the beginning develops more and more, with more and more voices and instruments. It is a growth like a tree growing from a seed." "Don't you think that the last thing Cy has there is too complicated?" asked Walt, indicating some of Young's color sketches. And a few moments later he was discoursing on what he wanted their abstract film to be. "I would like to see you stick to the soundtrack all the way through. We don't want to follow what anyone else has done in the abstract. We have never dealt in the abstract. We have given things a reason for existing and tried to convince the audience that it could happen or was possible. I think, even in this, if we take the soundtrack and use that and build through on that, it furnishes a reason for what we are doing on the screen." Throughout the making of Fantasia, Walt would insist on these 3 qualities: clarity, simplification, and a reason for everything done on the screen. Walt's idea for using 3D to make the form of the music clearer, he had seen an experiment using glasses to achieve the illusion, excited Ed Plum, the studio musician who was Fantasia's musical director. "It would be good if we could indicate the 3rd dimension on the Toccata, then start on a plane surface on the Fugue and come back into the 3rd dimension," said Plum. "It would be true to the Fugue," replied Stokowski, "if when the theme first comes on, you show a certain plane of distance, then when the second theme comes in, show a nearer plane, then nearer and still nearer as they come in. That is what the Fugue does." So while artists at the other cartoon studios were planning further adventures for Popeye and Porky Pig, artists at the Disney studio listened to Leopold Stokowski explain form in music. "Looking at this composition broadly," he said, "the Toccata is A, the Fugue is B, and we return to A at the end. The Toccata starts off with 3 phrases, which are like the playing of immense trumpets to call you to attention. For that reason, this composition is a wonderful selection with which to begin your picture. It is very arresting. After that, the music goes down low and swells up to a tremendous climax at the end of the Toccata. The Toccata is really all in one mass, very much alike. Then follows the immense contrast, the Fugue." But now Stokowski was seeing the music in his imagination, and thinking of the silence after the 3 phrases, he asked Walt a key question. "How will we represent the silence on the screen?" And Walt, who was hearing the pictures, answered, "At first, it will be all dark. Then the light comes up and highlights Stokowski's features. It is still dark, but as the orchestra starts, the color surges in. Stokowski becomes more of a silhouette, but still with the reflection of the color highlighting his face. Then let it all recede. In the silent spaces, we have nothing but the highlight. When the music comes in again, the color will surge up behind. We will tie everything together at the start. Stokowski and the orchestra then go off into the abstract forms in the fugue. Then come back and mix the two at the end. Then come back to the orchestra. We can get the effect of depth without going into cubes, etc. We can build mountains with our soundtrack, going back into the distance there, like building a line of hills, then another in back of that. At a later time," Disney said, "our definite aim, as I see it, is the soundtrack. I don't see blending clouds into it, or anything like that. Bach had nothing definite in mind when he composed this music. He was just dealing with music." John Hubley, who laid out several sequences in Rite of Spring, once observed that he was always amazed at how easily Walt Disney could give up the idea if he felt that he had come across a better one. After one or two meetings, it was decided to get away from the actual soundtrack animation and use designs suggested by the soundtrack, wrote Miles Pike, a member of the crew who created the Toccata's continuity. The idea of using silhouettes of Stokowski and the orchestra was acceptable at once. It was developed to show a relationship between the picture and the music, not only in form and color, but in instrumentation as well. The fugue didn't develop quite as easily, Pike explained. Probably the most difficult problem we had to face was the creation of abstract or semi-abstract forms which could be animated and not just pushed across the screen. So many things had to be considered. Did the form fit the music? Was it a picture of the sound? How did it make its entrance? Did it move vertically or horizontally? Or did it rotate or follow a wave movement? And the theme. Oh my God, don't forget the theme. It repeats 7 times throughout the fugue. Should the theme have its own fixed form, or should the form change with the development of the theme? All this, and Heaven too, had to be clarified so that it would make up in interest what it lacked in story or continuity. The final storyboard continuity was worked out by a team headed by Cy Young. The idea taken from Disney was that they were to imagine themselves sitting in a concert hall, listening to the music with their eyes closed.
What you will see on the screen is a picture of the various abstract images that might pass through your mind if you sat in a concert hall listening to this music. At first, you're more or less conscious of the orchestra. So our picture opens with a series of impressions of the conductor and the players. Then the music begins to suggest other things to your imagination. They might be, just masses of color, or there may be cloud forms, or great landscapes, or vague shadows, or geometrical objects floating in space.
Interestingly, when Disney picked the Toccata and Fugue to open the Fantasia program instead of an overture as originally planned, his choice met strong objections from Taylor, who said, "There you are doing the only not strictly legitimate thing in the whole program. It would not be played in a symphony concert to open the evening, nor a pop concert." "But Deems," said Stokowski, "I don't think that's a good reason. This isn't a pop concert. You can't compare this with anything. Don't think in the past tense, think in the future tense." "Doesn't the Toccata demonstrate an orchestra?" Walt asked the maestro. "Very well," said Stokowski. "Then I don't see how. I mean, why don't we use that in the beginning? Said Walt. And they did. In Art and Visual Perception, Rudolf Arnheim has written that a surprisingly strong expression of geometrical figures and movement has been demonstrated in a more elaborate abstract films of Oskar Fischinger, Norman McLaren, Walt Disney, and others. According to Moritz, Fischinger quit the Disney studio in disgust and despair before the Toccata section had ever been completed. Fischinger was obviously an artist who was not at his best working in a group, particularly a group that he did not control. For one Toccata sequence that Fischinger was assigned, he planned 4 different and simultaneous movements. Disney's passion for simplification reduced the 4 movements to 1, alternating waveforms. And yet, that heavy wave action that uses a highlight to interpret the violin theme is one of the strongest images in the film. The unique importance of Disney's Toccata and Fugue is that it presented the first animation of abstract art in a commercial feature film. It was the forerunner of the still small number of commercial films that have been made for a general audience, such as Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey and Disney's own Tron, in which there are sections that attempt to express feeling and emotion through color and form, moving in consonance with music rather than through drama. Examples of these sections include 2001 Stargate Corridor sequence and Tron's computer-generated imagery combined with music created on a Moog synthesizer. It is difficult, so many years after the post-World War II acceptance of abstract expressionism, to imagine the resistance of the general public to abstract art before the war. Disney hoped that the novelty of widescreen, 3D, and stereophonic sound would win acceptance for its abstract film, as the novelty of sound had finally won a place for his 3rd Mickey Mouse cartoon in the theaters, and the novelty of color had helped gain acceptance of his silly symphonies. Although widescreen and 3D proved economically unfeasible in 1940, abstract shapes moving in consonance with directional sound was apparently a success, at least according to the report of Emily Gunnar, art critic of the old New York World Telegram. "We have no need to talk again of the substance of abstract art," she wrote, "to point out the beauty of form and color per se, to insist that in arbitrary improvisations of lines, shapes, and spots there can be, if conceived by a true artist, as much beauty as exists in a painting of such natural forms as a landscape or a nude body. Now we write of rhythmic design, of patterns and tones arranged in counterpoint, of the delicate and exquisite relationships that can be established between planes or plastic movement, and hope to heaven we're making ourselves understood. Along comes Disney with his visual accompaniment to the Bach Toccata and Fugue, the first number in Fantasia, and it's all miraculously clear. The whole thing is a succession of beautifully colored abstractions, with sometimes faintly discernible in them the suggestion of violin bows, or the strings of a cello, or the curve of a bass viol. One or two of them recall Kandinsky especially. There were several closely related to the surrealist Miro, and the opening night audience, many of whom, doubtless, raised up their hands in horror at abstract paintings, loved it. So, did Disney and Stokowski enable us to, quote-unquote, see the music and hear the picture? Well, some of us did. Some of us felt the way Otis Ferguson did. He wrote of Fantasia that the screen itself, when the music is playing, is the only excuse I have ever seen for having eyes and ears at the same time.